Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming here tonight. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a member of this society, a former student at Churchill College, and tonight's guest speaker, Viscount Monckton of Brenchley.
Mr. President, sir, I'm going to give you the science of climate change, and I'm going to give it to you from a perspective which you will not have seen in the media, you will not have heard it from politicians, you will not have seen it in reports of the scientists who have taken charge of this debate. I'm going to talk to you of those parts of the science which they don't want you to hear about. So you may be thinking, what right does a non-scientist, albeit a former political advisor to prime ministers, have to talk to us about the science of climate change? Well, I have as much right as Al Gore has. He's no scientist, yet, like me, he made a movie about global warming, and it won an Oscar for Best Sci-Fi Comedy Horror. Now, I'm not going to give you, as he did in that film, my opinion about climate change, because it is as worthless as his. I confess at the outset, I am not a scientist of any sort, still less a climate scientist. It would therefore be totally inappropriate of me to lecture you about what view I think you should take on this subject. I'm going to take the approach of Fox News. We report, you decide. I'm going to show you an enormous amount of information, real information overload, from the scientific journals, which will give you a different perspective on climate change, because I don't want you simply to go on believing, if any of you do, in this new religion of climate change. My task here tonight is to de-smog this debate and allow you to see one or two aspects that have not yet been put in front of you. My approach has been very much one of inquiry and not of advocacy. I'm taking a scientific approach, rather as T.H. Huxley did when he said, "The improver of natural knowledge absolutely refuses to acknowledge authority as such. For him, skepticism is the highest of duties, blind faith, the one unpardonable sin." And the covenant which I propose to make to this House tonight is that I will be as sceptical of the non-conformists in this debate as I will with the conformists. It is not my job only to question those scientific papers that are put forward by one side. I'm going to try to give you what is a fair, reasonable and balanced look at this question, but it will slightly overemphasize, as you may think, the counter-consensual point of view simply by way of restoring balance in a debate where the counter-consensual view has not, until the kindness of this House, had a recent airing anywhere in the UK at all. Now, you may well become angry as this address unfolds. The reason why is that you'll be angry first at me, some of you, because I'll be revealing hard scientific evidence that will challenge just about every supposed fact that you've ever heard about global warming. So one-sided has the media presentation of this issue become that you may well, some of you, find what I have to say rather uncomfortable at first. But then, as my presentation unfolds, if you're intellectually honest, you will gradually become angry with the politicians, the movie makers, the school teachers and politicians who have, at best, been too lazy to give you the whole scientific truth and have at worst deliberately withheld the truth from you and distorted it beyond all reason or proportion. Now, I'm going to begin very briefly with what the climate change debate is not about. It's not about whether we can just freely pollute our beautiful planet without any care for our fellow creatures or for their future or our own. I'm not here to advocate ruinous overexploitation of the planet's resources. That is no part of my presentation at all. Secondly, the debate is not about whether we are adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, because we are. And thirdly, I'm not going to say anything to you about whether adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere is likely to increase temperature. On this side of the presentation, it is conceded that, of course, if you add a greenhouse gas to the natural greenhouse effect, then there will be some enhancement of temperature. So what the debate is about then, it's about whether we can trust the scientists, the politicians, the media who are driving us towards an avowedly alarmist view of what might happen if the weather became just a little warmer. Every 5 years or so, the IPCC produces a major assessment report on climate change. The most recent was published early in 2007. Now, the first chairman of this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was Sir John Horton. And he said, unless we announce disasters, no one will listen. There, from the chairman of the organisation which is supposed to be giving us unprejudiced science on climate change, is a statement that unless we announce disasters, no one will listen. A statement that we are going to reserve the right to ourselves to exaggerate the science so that we can make people listen to us. And with that background, we have to look at what are the motives of an organisation like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The first thing is quite obvious. The IPCC is a corporation, albeit without the constraint of shareholders. Like any corporation, it has a vested interest in putting itself first and maintaining its own existence and enhancing its own status and accreting to itself as much profit as it can. This is a matter of simple, commercial, practical, political reality. Whenever you set up an organisation to address a particular problem, it will go on addressing that problem, whether or not the problem actually exists. Now, as an illustration of the bias that has crept in to the IPCC's proceedings, I'm going to go back to the 1995 report that the IPCC produced. And it produced 3 statements, each of which, in one way or another, said that there isn't really any evidence, hard evidence, that said that we can attribute observed climate change to increase in greenhouse gases. We'll have the first of those now. Here it is. None of the studies cited above has shown clear evidence that we can attribute observed climate changes to the specific cause of increases in greenhouse gases. That was what the scientific draft said. The next one, no study to date has positively attributed all or part of the climate change observed to date to anthropogenic causes. The third one, any claims of positive detection of significant climate change are likely to remain controversial until uncertainties in the total natural variability of the climate system are reduced. All of those were saying quite plainly, we can't really tell if mankind has got anything to do with it. This was in the second assessment report of the official body on climate change. Now, clearly, this wasn't good enough. Because if this is all they were going to come up with, what's the point of going on subsidising an intergovernmental panel on climate change if it got nothing to do with mankind and we can't do anything about it? So instead, the politicians got at it, and presto, all three of the quotations I've just given you, which were in the draft approved by the scientists, were taken out by the politicians and bureaucrats, and the following was substituted. The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate. And that was the moment at which it became clear to everyone who was watching this with a shrewd enough eye that we were not dealing with objective science, but with a politically biased organisation with an agenda which included its own survival and which therefore had to say that there was a problem when the scientists had actually said there wasn't a problem. Now, these episodes, and many others like them which I could have quoted, raised in my mind, when I was first researching this, the possibility that the IPCC is indeed politically motivated to state a particular case regardless of the scientific truth. And I therefore began examining its documents myself. And I came across, in the 2007 report, of which I got the final draft which was reviewed by the scientists, an error so as to magnify tenfold the influence of climate change, supposed, on the melting of the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet. Here they are here. Now you can see if you add up these numbers here, they do not come to the IPCC's total. Why? Because the decimal points here that should be over here are, they've just multiplied all these numbers by 10. These four red numbers, they've all been multiplied by 10 when they shouldn't have been. Now, this is a document which we are told was reviewed and scrutinised by 2,500 scientists and reviewed by governments. Clearly, it was not. Downright, outright dishonesty and gross scientific inaccuracy to exaggerate tenfold the likely ice melt from those two ice caps. Now, these and other errors raise very serious questions about whether there is or even can be a consensus. We're told there's a scientific consensus, and Al Gore even tries to tell us that that consensus is unanimous. So do the learned papers of scientists in climate and related fields uniformly predict the catastrophes uniformly predicted by the BBC and other media which have taken formal, in BBC's case, or informal decisions to abandon any semblance of objectivity? No. A survey of 539 papers containing the words global climate change and published between 2004 and mid-February 2007 found that only one of the papers even mentioned the possibility that global warming might be catastrophic, and even that paper offered no evidence whatsoever in support of the imagined catastrophe. So given this absence of alarm in the peer-reviewed literature, where did this panic start? Well, let's begin with a graph of 1988. Now, this was put forward by James Hansen, now the director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, in the very hot summer of that year before the Senate in Washington. And I've made it a little clearer for you by that's what had happened. And then we get the predictions from the blue sky section of the graph from 1988 onwards. And we can see some very extreme predictions. Look at this case A there, the worst case. Then you get his likely outturn. This was his kind of best estimate of what would happen. And then you get an interesting one where he says, what happens if we gradually reduce the amount of CO2 from 88 until 2000, and then in 2000 we stabilize it and there are no longer any increases in CO2. And this, the green dotted graph here, is the one that he gets where it begins actually quite quickly to level off. Well, now what actually has happened in the climate? We're now going to look at that, and here it is. And you can see that basically what's happened is that most of the way along it has been tracking at or below the CO stabilisation figure, and it's currently here, and I think that by the end of this year it's going to be more or less still on line with that one, right at the bottom of his range of predictions. So temperature hasn't increased as much as Hansen told Congress it would. Therefore, this question arises, are today's temperatures, historically speaking, exceptional? Now, the first question I think we need to ask here is, has it been warmer than this before? One has heard in history of a medieval warm period when you could grow wine grapes in Scotland. You certainly can't do that now. They used to grow in Yorkshire. My family had estates there at about that time. The Vikings were farming places in Greenland which are now under permafrost. If you go to their major settlement in Greenland at Valsay, the place where they buried their bodies is now under permafrost. It certainly wasn't under permafrost when they buried them. So we know, therefore, that in Greenland, in Europe, when the great cathedrals were built, in Britain, there was a medieval warm period. So now what we're going to do is look at what the UN's report in 1990 said about the medieval warm period. It produced this graph, which I have colorized so you can see it clearly. Here is a thing showing the medieval warm period, and it was labeled by the IPCC as medieval warm period. It's very plainly visible there. Here is the little ice age during the Maunder minimum, when there were no sunspots on the sun for about 60 years and the temperatures went down. And here is the current period. Eventually it's going to go up a bit, but it's still a long way below what was shown in the IPCC's 1990 graph. Now, just 11 years later, in 2001, this graph appeared. No medieval warm period. Just like that, as Tommy Cooper might say. It vanished, it disappeared. And so we get this, what they call the hockey stick graph. It runs along all the way like this, and then it goes up here, as though this is somehow exceptional. Now, the UN, the IPCC, they were really pleased with this graph. They printed it 6 times, large and in full colour, in their 2001 report. The only graph to appear 6 times, the only graph to appear in full colour 6 times. The question then arises, how did they achieve this remarkable result in just 11 years to wipe out all the historical records, all the enormous number of papers in the scientific literature attesting in one way or another to the existence of a medieval warm period all around the world? How did they do it? Here's one of the things they did. They took a particular type of data, a particular data set, and here it is from Sheep Mountain, California, and this particular data set has a very satisfactory, from their point of view, hockey stick shape. Up it goes at the end there. The blade of the hockey stick and the shank along there. But this one from Mayberry Slough in Arizona doesn't have that. It has a sort of peak in 1800, but then otherwise it's more or less jogging along all in a straight line. So what did they do? They gave this data 390 times as much weighting in their computer program as they gave this data, because this data gave them the shape they wanted to have. It's an extraordinary thing. They then went on and left out the tree ring data set that included the medieval warm period. Because if you put it back in, then it showed that the medieval warm period was actually there. They said they'd included the data set they'd left out. They published a paper in Nature, 1998, and again in 1999. They said they'd included that data set, but they hadn't. They'd actually left it out. They'd hidden the missing data in a file which was marked on their own computer, where it was later found by 2 diligent researchers from Canada. They'd hidden it in a file marked censored data. That's what they'd done with it, censored data. They inserted their own estimates in place of the censored data, but did not publish or tell anyone the fact that they had done so. If the omitted data were reinserted, bingo! The vanished medieval warm period reappeared. Here's where it comes. Suddenly the medieval warm period is back. Now, the way the scientific method works is that if somebody puts forward a hypothesis that there was a hockey stick-shaped graph and there was no medieval warm period, they must make their data and their methods freely, fully, immediately, and widely available, so that tiresome nuisances like me can check to see whether they did the sums right, which in this case, alas, they didn't. A report by the National Academy of Sciences in the United States also confirmed that the graph was defective, saying that its conclusions were no better than plausible at best, and that it had a validation skill not significantly different from zero. But none of this, however much we may attack this graph, none of this tells us whether there was a medieval warm period. So now we're going to look at a few slides that establish where it is in the literature. Now this is done by taking 6,000 borehole temperature readings from all over the world. Of course, this is not what the actual temperature was, but it gives you a rough idea that yes, there was a medieval warm period, and yes, there was a little ice age. And then we move on to an isotope study of a stalagmite from Spannagel Cave in the Austrian Alps. Another stalagmite, Cold Air Cave, Makabanskat Valley in South Africa. Lots of these papers are showing the medieval warm period. But when I first wrote on this, I was accused by various sort of militant websites on this subject of cherry-picking. So let's just see a few more, shall we? Just so that you can see I'm not cherry-picking. Let's go to the Li Chao Peninsula from South China. Let's go to the northwestern Arabian Sea. Let's go to the Sargasso Sea, to New Zealand, to the North Island of New Zealand, to the Spanish Pyrenees, to northern Fennoscandia, to the Swiss Alps, 3 of them there, to Canada. Let's go to British Columbia. Let's go to the Azores. Let's go to coastal Peru. Let's go to coastal Peru again, just for fun. Let's go all the way to the summit of the Greenland ice sheet, and there it is again. Let's go to a timescale sensitive reconstruction of northern hemisphere temperatures. There's your hot spot for the medieval warm period. There's your cold spot for the little ice age. They're clearly shown on that graph too. Here is the reconstruction of a particular tree line from a particular species of tree, Zelkova carpinifolia, which shows the medieval warm period. Here, this is the line roughly corresponding to today's tree line. There it is, medieval warm period. Here is the Roman warm period, and here is the Holocene climate optimum, where for a period of around 1,000 years or more, the temperature was quite noticeably higher because the tree line was higher. And why is it called an optimum? Because actually, warmer is better. Why we're gloomy about this is it's quite extraordinary. It's better to have a warmer climate. Why do most species in the world live in the tropics? Because it's warmer there. Why do practically no species live in the Arctic and the Antarctic? Because it freezes your nuts off and it makes reproduction difficult. And then let's just look at something from the real world. These graphs are all very well, but here is a tree stump. See how isolated it is. It's dated 1340 AD by carbon dating, and that's at the height of the medieval warm period. It stands in splendid isolation, well above today's California tree line. And because it did exist, because there was a medieval warm period, and it was in some places 3 3/4 degrees Celsius higher the temperature than it is today, we cannot safely say that today's temperatures are exceptional. We can say, because everybody agrees this, that it was nature that caused the medieval climate warming. There's virtually nobody who would try to maintain that we were having enough of an influence on climate then to cause that warming. There was no medieval climate cataclysm. That's why we call it the medieval climate optimum, because it was rather nice and big cathedrals were built all over Europe. Civilization sprung up in places it couldn't have sprung up in before. Nature, therefore, it is a possibility, we can't draw this conclusion for definite, but nature may be causing most warming today. And finally, climate catastrophe, therefore, may not be either looming or likely. These are the conclusions we can respectively draw. So, if we assume that there were not enough 4x4s and SUVs driving around in the medieval warm period, what natural causes might there have been for the climate fluctuations over the past 1,000 years, which we now have really rather good grounds, I hope you'll agree, for suspecting may actually have occurred? Well, now we'll go on and have a look at one possible guilty party. And that's the sun, which is where, after all, the heat comes from. At the moment, the polar ice caps of Mars are melting. there has been warming noticed on the surface of Jupiter, on one of the moons of Neptune, even on far distant Pluto, all at the same time. And why is this? Because astronauts are taking their 4x4s up into space? No. It's because the sun, as we'll see, has been remarkably active. Now, Herschel, the astronomer, in 1801, noticed that when there were more sunspots and therefore more solar activity, grain prices went down because everybody was growing more grain. And this was in an 11-year cycle these sunspots tended to go. And even in that 11-year cycle, you could detect the changes in the grain prices, because even in the relatively small changes between the maximum and minimum of a solar cycle, that was enough to influence the way the grain grew, and Herschel spotted it. Now, let's go to this very interesting paper by Sami Solanki. He's one of the most expert solar physicists. He's very balanced. He doesn't take either side in this debate. What he says is the level of solar activity during the past 70 years is exceptional, and the previous period of equally high activity occurred more than 8,000 years ago. We find that during the past 11,400 years, the sun has spent only of the order of 10% of the time at a similarly high level of magnetic activity, and almost all of the earlier high activity periods were shorter than the present episode. So there is clear evidence that the sun is a lot more active now than it has been at any time since really the end of the last ice age. It's a quite extraordinary result. We go on then to look at the mismatch between CO2 and temperature over the period from 1880 to 1990. Now here you've got the CO2 graph, broadly similar to what I showed you before, going up in a sort of near exponential curve, and here you've got temperature jiggling up and down all over the place, and there really isn't a very good match between the two. So temperature doesn't track CO2 well, we've seen that, but it does track solar activity rather well, as several papers, which I'll now illustrate. Here's one from Solanki again and his colleague Fligg in 1999. The proxy for solar activity here is the length of the solar cycle. Quite a good track with temperature, as you may think. We go to the Central England temperature tracking solar activity. That's from a paper by David Bellamy in 2007. Then we've got one showing that monsoon activity tracks solar activities in the paleoclimate now, going a long way back. This is Neff et al. 2001. And then, of course, there's the Arctic, where again you see a rather nice correlation between the two. So the question then arises, we've seen all these different correlations from the scientific papers. I could have shown you dozens more, but time does not permit. How much influence can the sun actually have? Is it really as small as the IPCC would have us believe? Weren't there frost fairs on the Thames in the 60-year Monckton minimum when no sunspots were seen for ages? Well, the longest instrumental temperature record in the world is the Central England temperature series. Now, this series is very interesting. It shows that temperature rose 2.2 Celsius in 35 years between 1700 and 1735. The sun, not human industry, was the cause. Here it is over at the left-hand side here. A very steep increase. Now, we have to be careful when we cite evidence of this kind, because this is the oldest instrumental record we have, and therefore the instruments may not have been all that reliable. We're also dealing with temperatures in only one place, Central England. This might not have been a global effect. But even so, it's suggestive of the possibility that the sun, coming out of the Maunder minimum here, could have had a very considerable influence on temperature, an influence which would be wholly absent if you used the IPCC's very small estimate of the solar forcing. So is Solanki right to say that in the past 70 years there's been a period of exceptional solar activity? It's certainly exceptional in recent history. Here is the trend. This is done by another formidable solar physicist who has very close relations with NASA. This is Hathaway, and he shows here was your Maunder minimum, practically no sunspots at all. This is the sunspot number on the scale here. It's been smoothed a little, but it does suggest a pretty clear trend of ever increasing solar activity going back to the year 1700. So we're looking at nearly 300 years of it. So then we come to the conclusion and this is not my conclusion, this is a conclusion of the International Astronomical Union Symposium in 2004. This is what they said. This is not me talking here. Solar changes cause most climate change. Solar cycles are 11, 80 and 200 years long. We've seen the 11-year cycle very clearly in the charts we've seen. The sun caused today's warming. Today's warming is normal, not unusual. Today's warming will end soon. So how then do we distinguish natural from anthropogenic warming? We have to find a fingerprint of anthropogenic warming which would not occur if there were solar or ocean warming causing the change in temperature. Right. Well, we've already seen that temperature doesn't track CO2 concentration at all well in recent times. So let's see if we can find a good match. Now here there is a good match, and this is, here's your temperature anomalies which we saw before up there. Now, tracking them really quite nicely together are tropical outgoing long-wave radiation. Now, why is that likely to be a sensible result? Answer, because the sun is incident upon the tropics directly. Its azimuth angle is 90 degrees. It comes straight down into the tropics, and most heating, therefore, as a matter of fact, occurs in the tropics. And the atmosphere is like a giant engine which transports heat away from the tropics to northern latitudes and to some extent to southern latitudes. So you would expect that if there was going to be any correlation between global temperature anomalies here and any other outgoing long-wave radiation anomaly, you'd be most likely to find it in the tropics. And it's in the tropics, therefore, that we need to look for our hotspot. So let's look for it. Here from IPCC 2007 are the different climate forcings which they have modelled. There's a notable omission which we'll come to in a moment, but solar forcing, a fairly bland effect, volcanic ditto, anthropogenic ozone forcing, not much to that, likewise aerosol forcing. But here is an extraordinary picture quite unlike any of the others. Why? This is anthropogenic greenhouse gas forcing. And if you combine all these 5 forcings together and call them all forcings, it is that which predominates. You get this same pattern again. And here you have latitude across the bottom and altitude in the atmosphere measured in hectopascals up on this side. So you've got in the tropics, which is the area we said we needed to look at, you've got this signature effect of global warming that is predicted in the models. Now let's have a look at just one of several records I could give you of actual measurements of temperature. Again, we got the latitude down here and the altitude up here. That's where this hotspot is, or rather is not. And practically all the records of tropospheric temperatures in the tropics do not show this tropical hotspot at all. And the ones that do, they show no more than just a little flicker above the ground temperatures and nothing more than that. So what do we infer from this? We infer that there may be a very small effect from extra CO2 in the atmosphere, but it cannot be anything like as big as the models are predicting. So we now move on then to why are the models getting things wrong and predicting disaster? Here is one reason why models fail. Now, in mathematics, you can often find absolute proof. Here is a proof without words by me of, I don't say it's original, but I think it's by me, of Pythagoras' theorem. Here you have an irregular pentagon, and it contains within it either the squares of the 2 short sides and 2 of the right triangles we're looking at, or it contains the square on the hypotenuse and 2 triangles. That is an absolute, rigorous, complete proof of Pythagoras' theorem. Now, what the heck's Pythagoras' theorem got to do with global warming? Well, it's this, that in the physical sciences generally, and in particular in something like climate science, where the data we have are largely inadequate, there just isn't enough of it, you can't make absolute proofs most of the time. Here is a formidable atmospheric physicist from Japan, Shunichi Akasofu. No supercomputer, no matter how powerful, is able to prove definitively a simplistic hypothesis that says the greenhouse effect is responsible for warming. It can't be done. So we now have to look at another equation. There we are. This one you will all have known about. This is Einstein's equation. And now let's just magic it away and put another equation in its place. Broadly similar. You've still got radiant energy in watts per square metre on the left, but now you have emissivity, you have a constant, and you have temperature to the power of 4. Now, this is the Stefan-Boltzmann equation. And the importance of this equation is that it tells you that there is a formula that links the extra radiant energy that might arise from radiative forcings, like putting more CO2 in the atmosphere, and temperature. But you notice that the temperature is to the 4th power, which means that if you have an increase in radiant energy, the increase in temperature is actually going to be very small. And as a result, we can now look at a table of the different values for how much we might expect temperature to change that are available in the scientific literature. And you'll see it's a very huge range. Here's my own calculation, and we get 1.6 degrees Celsius as the change in temperature for a doubling of CO2. Now, the IPCC says 3 Celsius, about twice what I make it to be. And one of the things that's been said to me over and over again by the conformists is, oh yes, but the science of this has been settled for 100 years. It was Arrhenius who did the first calculations in his paper of 1896, and he said it was somewhere between 4 and 8 Celsius for a doubling of CO2, and the Stern report says 11, and so how dare you say only 1.6? But you see, I don't just read English, I also read German. And in 1906, Arrhenius, having the Stefan-Boltzmann equation available to him, which he hadn't quite got hold of in his first paper, recalculated everything. And he came to the same conclusion as I had, that for a doubling of CO2 concentration, you will get 1.6 Celsius of temperature change. And this is the range of temperature that is there. So why so wide a range? Maybe because we really don't know how much CO2 there is effect on temperature. And we're now going to look at some of the constraints that limit the effect which CO2 can have. First of all, here is its percentage by volume in the atmosphere. It did occupy 0.03% of the atmosphere in 1750. It now occupies, getting on for 0.04%, and that gives you a change of 1/10,000th part of the atmosphere more now than in 1750 is occupied by CO2. Now that, in itself, is a rather simplistic analysis, so we're going to go a little further. The IPCC has constantly rethought how much it thinks CO2 influences temperature. And in that forcing formula that I showed you before, the coefficient Z, it was 6.4 in 1995, it was 5.35 in 2001. They no longer publish it, but I've managed to calculate it from the data they have provided. It's 5.27 now. So it's come down by nearly 20% in just 12 years. Equivalent, if you like, to a 20% reduction in the entire greenhouse gas emissions of the world in only 12 years. So the consensus does not agree with itself. And the most extraordinary thing is that the IPCC, notwithstanding these reductions and many other reductions I could point to, has maintained its best central estimate of climate sensitivity at 3 degrees Celsius in response to a doubling of CO2 throughout. None of this has been recalculated properly. I don't think we're getting this honest science. So if we move quickly on then to the next slide, here we get a rather prodigious mismatch again between CO2 concentration, which is the black line, and temperature concentration, which is the blue line, going right back to almost 600,000 years into the past. And here we had almost 7,000 parts per million of CO2 compared with 385 or thereby today. 7,000 then. Temperature managed to get up to about 22 Celsius and has never really gone much higher than that at any time over the past 500 million years. As best it can be reconstructed. There are, of course, again, difficulties going that far and getting accurate results, but the IPCC itself says that in the Cambrian, carbon dioxide certainly went up, in its opinion, to around 6,000 parts per million, so this is not a controversial graph. What it is controversial is that, again, it doesn't show a terribly good link between the two, and it doesn't show, in particular, the runaway climate change when we had a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that the Tory party has written about in one of the most scientifically illiterate considerations of climate change that I've ever had the misfortune to have to read. So we then go on to look at this logarithmic effect that the first 20 parts per million of CO2 have a very much greater effect, not probably quite as much greater as is shown here, than all the remaining 400 that follow it. So every time we put more CO2 in the atmosphere, it has less effect than it had before. Then we come on to a problem of how long does it stay in the atmosphere once we've put it there. Now the answer is it's around 5 to 10 years, best estimate around 7 years. Here are a couple of dozen papers. Let's have another look, let's have some more of these. You see plenty of references there. But bingo, the IPCC says, oh no, let's call it 50 to 200 years. What they've done is to produce a weaselly definition of what the atmospheric residence time is. Now to you and me, being simple, unscientific folk, we think we burn something and so we create some carbon dioxide and up it goes into the atmosphere. There's a molecule. How long on average does it stay in the atmosphere? And they don't define it that way. They say, well, it's the time required for the atmosphere to adjust to a future equilibrium state if emissions change abruptly. That's got nothing to do with any definition of residence time that any respectable scientist would recognise. And they have been widely criticised for adhering, ever since 1990, to this perfectly ludicrous definition, which is not in the least bit helpful in trying to work out what effect CO2 will really have. So we now summarise this by saying that there are some quite powerful constraints on how much impact CO2 can have. There's very little additional CO2 in the atmosphere. CO2 has only a few principal absorption bands, the most important of which for these purposes is probably the one at 14.99 microns. At the surface, water vapour dominates CO2. We've already seen one effect of that. It's only further up that you get any warming effect at all, and that's why its effect diminishes logarithmically the more you put into the atmosphere. CO2 is not particularly potent. It's only 1/23 as potent as methane, for instance. There's no tropical mid-troposphere hotspot. We saw that. Its atmospheric residence time is short, 5 to 10 years, whatever the UN says, and CO2 correlates very poorly with temperature, both in our own time and, of course, going all the way back 500 million years. Quite powerful constraints on what CO2 can achieve. We have to try and work out what effect can it have on the climate. And here we're going to wander into territory where all kind of reason departs. And here we have Al Gore in An Inconvenient Truth. And we're going to look at just a few of the fantastically interesting errors in his film. He says there is one relationship that's more powerful than all the others, and it is this: when there's more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer because it traps more heat from the sun inside. And what he's trying to do there is to suggest that in the former climate, when we weren't adding much CO2 to the atmosphere, it was the CO2 that was changing, and that was causing the changes of temperature that led to the beginning and ending of the ice ages. That's the order of precedence which he gives. It is almost unanimous in the scientific peer-reviewed literature that that is not the case. Here is Pettit et al., 1999. Here's CO2 concentration and here's temperature. They appear to track very nicely together. But if you look at them closely enough, it is actually the temperature that changes first by somewhere between 800 and 2,800 years, depending on which paper you read, and the CO2 which follows. Let's go on to the next one. Now, one of the problems we've seen is that correlation doesn't always imply causation, and it didn't in Gore's case, because here we've got Sunspot number on the bottom and the number of Republican senators in the US Senate. There's a beautiful correlation there. I think you'll have to accept that I have now, actually it was Douglas Keenan, a friend of mine, who has identified a really important climatic result. So moving on then, we're now going to look at some other errors. Here's another one. We have seen in the last couple of years a lot of big hurricanes, and then, of course, came Katrina. Pictures of Katrina smashing up poor old New Orleans. Heart-rending stuff. It was only Category 3 when it did so, but it still did the most terrible damage. And let's see whether that's got anything to do with hurricanes. Now, look at this. There has actually been no increase in the number of Atlantic hurricanes that make landfall throughout the entire past century. Simply unchanged. Let's go on and look at a few more of these errors. Here's number 3. Japan didn't get as much attention in our news media, but they set an all-time record for typhoons. Oh, no, they didn't. Here it is, typhoons, and just in case that isn't enough, here are the cyclones as well. Downtrend. Let's have the next one. There had been warnings that hurricanes would get stronger. Oh, had there? Yes, there had, actually. There are one or two people who said so. And, oh, boy, look at this graph. The trend is definitely upwards, absolute catastrophe. But now let's show, that's part of the story, let's show the whole story. And, oh, yes, if they'd gone back to a different start date, remember this start date dodge? We've seen it before with the IPCC, now we see it here. No trend. So now let's have another error. The insurance industry, recovered losses are going up. See the damage from these severe weather events. Oh, yes, look at it. Unadjusted losses at money prices. Here we go. Oh, yes, absolutely ghastly, 2005. Bad, increase, shocking. Oh, dear, now we've adjusted it for today's prices and the fact that more people are living in harm's way than were before. The next error, there's a faster build-up of the heat here at the North Pole in the Arctic Ocean and the Arctic generally than anywhere else on the planet. Yes, it is true, if you stick to that sentence on its own, that most of the increase in temperature tends to be in northern latitudes. This is predicted, again, for perfectly good reasons. If you get any kind of warming, it is not a signature effect of anthropogenic warming. But we have a problem here because in 1940 it was clearly quite a lot warmer in the Arctic than it is today. So, these are something which your newspapers wouldn't have shown you. Icebound vessels all over the Arctic in April of this year. Arctic climate is highly variable. You'll get the Independent reporting as it did last week. 22 degrees Celsius record temperatures in the Arctic. What they mean record is record in just the last 30 years. We know perfectly well that Amundsen in a sailing ship was able to sail through the Northwest Passage in 1903. Next error. A new scientific study shows that for the first time they're finding polar bears that have actually drowned, swimming long distances of up to 60 miles to find the ice. Enough to make anyone's heart bleed. But what's the truth? That study he was referring to was by Monckton and Gleason, 2005 and 2006. 4 dead polar bears. That's what that entire thing is based on. And how did they die? What do Monckton and Gleason tell us about how they died? They said it was because there was exceptionally high sea states and very high winds and the poor critters were swamped. Shit happens, and it did. And here is the gentleman himself. Quite a smart suit. And he says that West Antarctica is considered relatively more stable than another big body of ice that is roughly the same size, Greenland. The huge Greenland ice sheet. Come on, let's see what we've got here. The Greenland ice, oh dear, it hasn't been getting thinner after all. It's been growing at 2 inches a year for a period of a whole decade. That's 20 extra inches across several 100,000 square miles of ice. And now this is another error by Gore. He says that in the last 30 years, global warming has caused the snows of Kilimanjaro to disappear. The romance of it, the terror of it. No more of Hemingway's stories. The snows of Kilimanjaro are disappearing. But monthly mean air temperatures only vary slightly around the annual mean of minus 7.1 degrees Celsius. Has anyone tried to melt water at minus 7.1 degrees Celsius? If you try to melt ice at that, you can't do it. Temperatures never rise above the freezing point. No, they don't. The nearest they get to it is minus 1.6 Celsius. Molg et al., 2003, one of a series of papers which show quite clearly that the melting of Kilimanjaro has got absolutely nothing to do with global warming because it isn't warming up there. Onwards. The ice has a story to tell, and it is worldwide. Let's see. 1820. The deglaciation of the glaciers began, and it has continued on a more or less linear trend since then, and we didn't really begin to have much effect on the climate until around the late 1940s. The rate has been absolutely uniform throughout, so it's got very little, probably nothing to do with us. Next one. Lake Chad, oh yes, these lakes, Lake Chad fading away, but unfortunately the record, Cohen-Foley, shows that it's nothing to do with us. In 4000 BC, the lake was huge. Today it's much smaller. The average depth is only 10 foot. It's been dry, totally dry before in 8,500, 5,500, 2,100 BC, and over-extraction by changing local practices and growth in population is what has caused the decline in Lake Chad. Foley and Co. say so. Now, oh yes, then we have the Sahara. Unbelievable tragedies because of this spread of the Sahara Desert. No. Let's go on. There you are. The Sahara has recently lost 300,000 square kilometres to vegetation, the precise opposite of what Gore tells you is the fact. Next one. I want to focus on West Antarctica. They've measured disturbing changes on the underside of this ice sheet. So let's go. Problem. The disturbing changes seem to have been caused by thickening ice. Gore Error 17. The citizens of these Pacific nations, this one is Tuvalu, the Maldives, you know them all, Carteret Islands, all had to evacuate to New Zealand. None of these nations has evacuated to New Zealand. I've checked with the New Zealand High Commission. It's just not true. And here, sea level rise. What sea level rise? This is Kandahar 2005. Johnston Island, no sea level rise for 50 years. Down to Saipan, none for 22 years. No sea level rises. Onwards, Maldives. Myrna et al. Now, Niels Axel Myrna knows more about sea level than anyone else in the world. He's studied it for 30 years continuously. And no trend, basically. You know, it's been higher before. It's about at its mean over the last 1,200 years now. No problem. Besides, corals can grow at 10 times the rate that sea level is even predicted to rise. So there's no reason why any of these islands should disappear, and no need for any of the citizens to go to New Zealand or anywhere else. Next slide. Ah, yes, mosquitoes. There are cities that were founded because they were just above the mosquito line. Nairobi is one. Nairobi was not founded because it was above the mosquito line. It was founded because it was a pre-existing Kikuyu watering hole on the Kikuyu escarpment on the railway known as the Lunatics Line between Mombasa and Dar es Salaam. That was why Nairobi was built where it was, and there have been at least 10 major outbreaks of malaria in Nairobi between its foundation and today, in one of which, a long time ago, the mosquitoes spread as far up as Eldoret, which is nearly 10,000 feet above sea level and about 3 times the height of Nairobi. So all of that stuff from Gore's film is simply arrant nonsense. Here is what has actually happened. We've had, between 1880 and 1945, here are malaria outbreaks at high altitudes, but in the period when most of the supposed global warming caused by us has happened, this is recent, that's from 1945 onwards, you can see the altitude there, they're all much lower down. Rather a graphic demonstration that there is no appreciable increase in the height at which malaria goes. Why? The biggest malaria outbreak in the world was in the 1920s and 30s in that hotspot of the climate known as Siberia. 600,000 people were killed, 30,000 of them as far north as Arkhangelsk on the Arctic Circle. And the only connection between malaria and climate is that the malaria mosquito requires a temperature of at least 15 degrees Celsius during its relatively short breeding season, but can otherwise survive very comfortably. Thank you. It's nothing whatever to do with global warming. Next slide. Now this is the biggie. This is the one that everybody gets most scared about. The city of Santa Barbara has decided to paint a line through the entire county showing where the 20-foot level rise would come when sea level, which it imminently expects to rise, will reach that level. Why does it think that? Because Al Gore has said so. The St. Albert has pronounced. And behold, sea level will rise 20 feet. Oh dear, no it won't. Because the second assessment report says maybe 3 feet. Third assessment report, 2 feet 11. Fourth assessment report, 1 foot 10. But maybe if we have a more realistic level of population, 1 foot 5. So there's the worst exaggeration in the film, and arguably the worst and most serious in this entire debate. I could have shown you, we haven't time, another 14 or 15 errors, equally bad, but that is how astonishingly inaccurate this particular film is. Now, here's one of the problems. Whatever damage we might have been conceived to have done to the climate by putting CO2 in it, China is now the one to watch. If Britain were to shut down completely, turn off all the lights, and have no trains, planes, aeroplanes, hospitals, industries, nothing, then the total emissions that we would therefore not be putting out would be made up by just the increase in Chinese emissions in less than 2 years. Apply that to the whole of Europe and the United States and Canada, and you're looking at China and India between them, making up the difference just in the growth of their emissions within perhaps 10 to 15 years, even if we were to shut down altogether the whole of the Western economies. That's not going to make any difference, let alone a sufficient difference. Let's move on. And here we come to what I think is the most tragic aspect of this whole debate. Here you have child mortality up to the age of 5 per 1,000 persons born, again versus CO2 emissions along the bottom, and here the more the CO2 emissions, the fewer the deaths you get of children before the age of 5. Once again, poor old Africa right up there. Look at that, Sierra Leone, 285 people per 1,000 dying if their children are under 5, compared with 7.7 per 1,000 in Iceland. And CO2, the correlation there, again, you might say it doesn't imply causation, but there are reasons why it should. And if, therefore, you say to the third world, no, you can't have the carbon emissions we've already had that have made us prosperous, that have reduced our mortality rates, then you are condemning them to die in their tens of millions. And I do not think that is something which this House ought to find acceptable. Let's move along and see the problem in a different light. Here, the world population is growing very rapidly, not particularly rapidly in the prosperous countries, because, and this is the paradox of population, it's the level of prosperity which determines your rate of increase in population. The more prosperous you are, paradoxically, the less fast you will reproduce. There are many economic, social, and medical reasons why this should be so. If we say to third world countries, you are going to have to deny yourselves carbon emissions, the likely effect of that, demographically speaking, is going to be that they will increase their population, or at the very least fail to reduce it towards stability, which they would be able to do if they were allowed the prosperity, which is very closely correlated with fossil fuel consumption. We could be advocating policies that will actually increase not only the poverty in these countries, but the environmental disaster that poverty produces of overpopulation and hence depletion of resources and incredible damage to the environment. And of course, if there are lots more people, however way you stack it, there's going to be a larger carbon footprint, whether you like it or not. Well, now, there are two other considerations we need to look at. One other major one, and that is, shouldn't we take precautions just in case the scientists are right that are trying to push this alarmist notion? The murderous, I've called it, precautionary principle. It's not a principle at all. It's an expedient used by the environmentalist lobby to justify schemes which, without a slogan of that kind, would be seen for what they are, which is barking mad and incredibly cruel. Now, I'm going to look at two previous worldwide scares, both of them quite recent. One was a real scare, one was a bogus scare. Both of them, the policies were got disastrously wrong because of the effect of pressure groups, and the result was that in each case, millions died. Here we go. HIV. Now, 20 years ago, I had just come out of number 10. I went across to the US Army Medical Research Division, who had done the first detailed researches on AIDS. I said, my cabinet needs to know what this is going to do and what we should do about it. And the guy in charge of the research, almost in tears, said, oh my God, how nice that somebody is asking rather than telling me. He said, I'll tell you what we need to do. We need to make sure that we test everyone to find out who's got it, and we isolate, in the kindliest way possible, those who have got it. That is the standard procedure with any fatal infectious transmissible disease. That's what you do. And I said, well, that's rather difficult, isn't it, socially? We've got campaigning groups saying we mustn't do that. He said, yes, we have. But if they prevail, tens, perhaps hundreds of millions will die. And he said, I beg of you, use your voice, go and write and say we must do this, because it will help us internally to argue this case, which we're not winning at the moment. So I wrote, first in the US and then in the UK. I was subjected, as a result of those articles, to some of the most intense personal vituperation and vilification that I've ever received in a long and sometimes controversial career. I was the subject of hate mail, phone calls, threats, death threats, the lot, because I suggested that people who got AIDS ought to be isolated so that people who hadn't got it wouldn't get it. This was regarded as totally unacceptable and cruel and vicious and etc. And it was heartbreaking, and I mean heartbreaking. What then happened? Let's move on. Since I wrote those articles, and I failed to persuade people to do the right thing. 25 million people died worldwide. 40 million now are infected. 7.5% infected south of the Sahara. 0.7% infected in the United States. And now, a warning to the United States and eventually to us, 1% is the epidemic threshold. Once 1% prevalence is achieved in the United States, nobody's talking about this over there, then you can't stop it spreading right through the population as it has in Africa. That's what happens. It'll be a bit slower than in Africa for various factors, but it will still spread. It will kill millions, even in the countries of the West, because we did not have the courage to face down the narrow vested interests of those who did not realize the harm they were doing, because we know from epidemiology that if you isolate cases, you don't get deaths like this. Let's move on from this horrible story. These are the larvae of the Anopheles mosquito. And there are 3 interesting little letters which are entirely absent from the IPCC's ramblings about malaria in its latest report. And those letters are DDT. Before the DDT ban, which was brought in as a result of environmentalist pressure, there were 50,000 deaths per year from malaria. After the DDT ban, 1 million deaths per year from malaria. It's still about 850,000 now. Total excess deaths, depending on which scientific paper you read, between 30 and 50 million people died and are still dying because of that crazy decision by first the United States of all countries to ban DDT. The DDT ban was lifted on the 15th of September 2006. Finally, the world's bureaucracy that governs this, the World Health Organization, decided that enough was enough. And Dr. Arata Kochi said the following. He said, "Quite often in this field, politics comes first and science second. We must take a position based on the science and the data." And that, in essence, is the position that I'm inviting you in this House to take tonight. There are moral issues, clearly moral issues, that are raised by this debate. And I want to look at those moral issues now. I want to sum up what I've said to you. Now, Al Gore says, as you can see on that slide, "I believe this is a moral issue." And so it is a moral issue. To announce disasters or scary scenarios, to over-represent factual presentations in place of adherence to the strict scientific objective truth, that is a moral issue. To allow politicians to insert false data into official scientific documents, to alter those documents so as to contradict or overstate scientific conclusions, to manipulate decimal points so as to engender false headlines by exaggerating tenfold, those are moral issues. To claim scientific unanimity where none exists, to assert that catastrophe is likely when most scientists do not, to exalt theoretical computer models which cannot in any event work over real-world observations, to misstate the conclusions of scientific papers or the meaning of observed data, to overstate the likely future course of climatic phenomena by several orders of magnitude, those are moral issues. To reverse the sequence of events in the early climate, to persist in false denial that past temperatures exceeded today's, to state that climate events that have not occurred have occurred, to ascribe these non-events as well as specific extreme weather events unjustifiably to humankind, those are moral issues. And above all, to inflict upon the nations of the world a policy of ever grimmer energy starvation, calculated not merely to inconvenience the prosperous, but to condemn the very poorest to remain in poverty forever and to die unheeded in their tens of millions for want of the light and heat and power and medical attention which we have long been fortunate enough to take for granted. That is a moral issue. So this house is the house of youth. Here, high ideals are shaped and sharpened. Here, of all places, it is surely understood that in each of us, however far apart, in mere distance or origin or wealth or achievement, there is the spark of the divine, the image and likeness of our Creator. That by this communion with our Maker, each of us, however poor, is of unique and precious value, that therefore there is only one race, the human race, that the suffering children of Africa of Asia and South America, imploring us with their hopeless, hopeful eyes, are our people. We must get the science right, or we shall get the policy wrong. We have failed them and failed them before. We must not fail them again.
We know of a number of feedbacks, including water vapour, the most important feedback. Yet your use of the Stefan-Boltzmann law excludes the effect of water vapour entirely. Not only is there an effect of water vapour, but there's also an effect of carbon dioxide from the carbon sinks. As temperature rises, carbon is released from places such as the Amazon rainforest. There's also an effect of methane, which we're already seeing. Now, in your talk, the feedback's not even considered, but in the IPCC report, the interacting effect of all these feedbacks, you have a vicious circle, but you have vicious circles on vicious circles. That's what we're facing in this current situation, and by the end of the century. So how do you deal with the feedbacks? And apparently there's very little extra CO2 in the atmosphere. Is an increase from 280 to 380 very little? That's all. Thanks.
First of all, the feedbacks, of course, I did allow for those in the way that the IPCC itself allowed for them by adjusting the Stefan-Boltzmann value of 0.3 Kelvin per watt per square metre of radiative forcing to make it 0.5, which is an increase of, obviously, 67%. And that is, broadly speaking, what the IPCC has done again in its 2007 report. To look at one or two of these climate feedbacks, let me explain what a feedback is. When a radiative forcing of any kind perturbs what would otherwise be the uniform behaviour of the climate, then temperature will go up, and the fact of temperature going up will, it is thought, induce further changes in the climate which cause temperature to go up still more. Now, there is, to talk about your compounding effect of these feedbacks, that they feed upon each other to a certain extent, there is now, for the first time in IPCC's 2007 report, admittedly buried in a footnote halfway through an incredibly technical description of feedbacks in Chapter 8, which is on how the computer models work, there is quite a simple formula, which is what the IPCC recommends for calculating the effect of those feedbacks. And in my own calculations, I have therefore allowed for the mutual reinforcement to which you quite rightly refer. To study one or two of the individual feedbacks, the water vapour feedback is, of course, largely cancelled out by the lapse rate, which arises from convection and other atmospheric processes. However, for purposes of my calculations, reaching the 1.6 Celsius for a doubling of CO2, which is my best estimate, I have allowed the IPCC's values as published in their 2007 report, and I have not sought to argue with or amend those values or in any way to change the mutual reinforcement formula. The CO2 feedback is indeed one which is evident, but it's really quite small. Indeed, the IPCC doesn't really know how big it is. It publishes a range of estimates from 25 to 225 parts per million per doubling of CO2. This is a very big range. Their best estimate, which is really only a guess, which interestingly was arrived at by nothing more scientific than a show of hands, is 87 parts per million by volume for a doubling of CO2. And that would have a not quite negligible, but still a very small impact on temperature as a feedback in its own right. As to methane feedback, that is not quantified at the moment in the IPCC's documents for the very good reason that the atmospheric concentration of methane, which had been rising on a curve quite similar to that of CO2, ceased to rise in about the year 2000 and has not risen since, suggesting that the idea of a methane feedback may not be observed in reality. As to your point about 280 to 380 parts per million, that's an extra 100 parts per million, but it still is only an extra 0.01% of the atmosphere by volume. And given that it is also a logarithmic effect, I have done the calculations on how much effect that would have on climate, strictly according to the IPCC's methods, precisely to avoid any arguments of that kind. And I think that answers all three of your questions. Sir.
In your presentation, you gave a very convincing argument as to why we shouldn't trust all of these people who cherry-pick their data, who choose what to believe, such as the liberal left, Al Gore, and even the BBC, and at times you even went so far as to insult nature. As a politician, as a journalist, as a card-carrying conservative and Christian, why should we believe you?
I did start out by saying, it's a very fair question, that I was a Huxleyan skeptic, and therefore I was skeptical of both sides of the argument. And I suggest that anyone, particularly who is writing for a university science magazine, I say this in the friendliest possible way, should equally be skeptical of both sides of the argument. You should be as ready to be skeptical of my presentation, however sophisticated, however eloquent you may or may not have thought it to be, as you should of the points which I was asking you to be skeptical of, because the way the scientific method works best was laid down as long ago as 1934 in a seminal paper by Karl Popper. And the principle is very simple. And it is that you can, if somebody who is a scientist offers a hypothesis which needs to be tested, then he must make available his data and methods so that that hypothesis can be tested by others. And you cannot ever prove a hypothesis in the way that you can prove the theorem of Pythagoras. You can merely improve it by repeating the original results and getting the same outcome. Or you can disprove it by showing in some manner that it was wrong. That's the correct way to do science, always to be skeptical, always to test, and as Albert Einstein used to say, always to go on asking questions. Sir, you find the microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. During your very well staged and very interesting presentation, you made the quite obvious claim, I have to admit, that maybe the sun has something to do with climate change. The sun is hotter and we all get a little bit hotter or something like that. What my question is, do you reckon or do you think that there is any actual damage, even apart from climate change, that CO2 emissions can make? And if so, do you think that this as a problem should be in any way addressed or not?
I'm afraid that my conclusion at the moment, it's a very fair question, my conclusion is that the correct policy to deal with our increased CO2 emissions is to do precisely nothing. It simply makes no sense to address what, on the calculations that I've done, is not going to be a serious problem. Now, my calculations are not controversial. They're rooted very firmly in the IPCC's own data and methods, including, some quite sophisticated points, such as whether I'm allowing for the mutual reinforcement of different climate feedbacks to feed upon each other. All of these things have been allowed for in my calculations, and I can't make it into a problem, however hard I try. And I think one needs to be much more hard-nosed about this, to accept that they don't really have enough data to draw the conclusions they're drawing, to accept that there are the constraints upon the effectiveness of CO2 as a forcing agent, which are very powerful constraints. They do limit how much damage it can really do. So my conclusion indeed is that we need to do nothing at all. Sir, you've been asking for a long time.
You said that the snows of Kilimanjaro are not disappearing because they're getting warmer, because it isn't getting warmer up there. Well, why are they disappearing?
Certainly. The papers by Molg et al. Of 2003 that I cited, and a string of other papers that I could have cited, attribute it to a combination of the long-term climatic shift, which, for instance, has caused glacial recession all over the place, and has been a particularly evident shift in that region since long before humankind could have had any impact on climate. It dates back, in Kilimanjaro's case, roughly to the 1880s, if I remember correctly. And the other thing is imprudent post-colonial deforestation of the region around the summit, which has led to desiccation of the climate, which accelerates the ablation of the glaciers both directly and by reducing renewed precipitation. And those are said to be the reasons why Kilimanjaro snows are ablating, and it has nothing to do with climate change. And that does seem to be, I won't say it's the unanimous consensus, but it is the overwhelming consensus of the scientific papers which I've read on the subject. Shall we have you in the red, because it's a good colour?
You say that we're not facing anthropogenic climate change, but you do seem to say we are facing some sort of climate change. So what do you think we should really be doing about this, given what you said about malaria and AIDS not really doing enough?
Yes.
So what should we get on and do now while we can, or should we leave it for a long while? And what do you actually think we're going to face in the next century, say?
We shouldn't be so darn miserable about it. This is not a problem we need to cry about, even if it is a problem, which really, on looking at it very closely, I don't think it is. We don't need to do anything now about it, except adapt as problems arise. For instance, we're not going to get a sudden catastrophic collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet or the Greenland ice sheet over a period of 10 years, causing sea level to rise instantly by 20 feet in the way that Gore imagines, showing Manhattan being wiped out and the Netherlands and various other places disappearing off the map. This is just not going to happen. So yes, we accept, of course, anybody's got to accept on looking at the temperature records, that it's got a certain amount warmer over the past century. But since the last UN report in 2001, and that now is getting on for 7 years ago, there has been no increase in global temperatures. Global warming has stopped. Even the Met Office, which is one of the worst of the proselytizers for the extreme view of climate change, has had to admit that global warming at the moment has stopped. So really we have reached a stasis in temperatures. And while this very exceptionally prolonged solar minimum that we're in at the moment, that's now lasted 18 months with practically no sunspots, continues, I wouldn't expect us to see record temperatures really very much. I think what's going to happen is that if the solar physicists are right, and they are near unanimous again on this, then in 10 years' time we're going to get quite a lot of solar cooling, which at the very least will offset any anthropogenic warming that we may be causing. But I wouldn't say that we aren't causing any anthropogenic warming. What I would say is that the amount of warming we're causing is near vanishingly small at the moment, and I don't expect it to get all that much bigger, even with China and India coming on stream. So let's not worry too much. Sir, have you asked one yet? Do go ahead.
Coming to the motive of why the IPCC, Al Gore, and as somebody else mentioned, George Bush's current administration is supporting the pro-environmental lobby now. I think motive is pretty important. I was wondering about the fact that if there is an environmental problem that can be actioned, if that theory survives, let's say, then you will need transnational, supranational legislation, which will mean the reduction of sovereignty for nations. I was wondering if those who might be interested in centralization of world power may have something to do with this, and therefore apparently unconnected groups such as the IPCC, the liberal left, and George Bush's lot might be being persuaded by this lot.
Thank you. That's a most interesting question, and I can give you some illumination on it. There certainly is what I would call, and I will use slightly contentious language if I may, just for once, I've been dying to all night, an atheistic, humanist, bureaucratic, centralist tendency, which, go for it, which does want further centralization of power in bureaucratic hands. Curiously, there's a rather interesting environmental effect of this. And we need here to go back to economics for a moment and cite the work of Milton Friedman, the late Milton Friedman, who died last year, a wonderful man, whom I met many years ago. And his central thesis was that if you allow the state, whether national or transnational, to do any given thing, it will cost the state twice as much and it'll do it half as well as if you let the private sector do it. Now, when we say that it costs the state twice as much, remember that cost is a proxy for CO2 emissions. Typically, if a thing costs twice as much, it's likely, broadly speaking, all other things to be equal, to emit twice as much CO2. So if you allow centralization of power to increase in the hands of governments, you are likely to increase the world's carbon footprint compared with leaving things in the hands of the private sector. So that to that extent, you get once again Monckton's law of opposite consequences in government intervention, where governments try to centralize power, and in doing so, they increase the world's carbon footprint while trying to reduce it. So there are some very interesting considerations that your question gives rise to. I myself am not a great believer in the existing transnational entities. They have tended to become expensive, corrupt, inept, lazy, and valueless. I should like to see an end to a lot of them. I don't think they do very much good, and I certainly don't see any case whatsoever for allowing the IPCC to continue in existence for a moment longer. I agree entirely with my peer, Lord Lawson of Blaby, who has called for its outright and immediate abolition. Madam, yes.
Thank you for your kind words and your time tonight. I would just like to ask, how politically viable do you believe a departure from the conventional view on global warming is, and how do you propose to overcome the unbalanced political and media presentation of the issues?
A lovely question, that, right up my street. I think we've just got to wait and watch, quietly tell the scientific truth as best we understand it, without trying to proselytize, without trying to make political points, without trying to score points off the opposition. You know, I didn't choose Al Gore for the sake of poking fun at Al Gore, or making ad hominem remarks about him, or theorizing as to why he made so many errors. I merely pointed out that there were errors in that film, because it is in that film that all the fears which are being peddled by the media and the politicians are encapsulated in one place in an extraordinary way. So I think we need not worry. We need merely wait, and gradually the truth will emerge. What we need to do is to try to make sure that in the meantime as little damage is done as possible, particularly in those poorer countries whose citizens are so deeply vulnerable, as we've seen in the AIDS and DDT cases, to wrong decisions taken by us to please narrow environmentalist or other specialist vested interests who put their own interest in front of the interest of us all. One more question.
You mentioned earlier that the current major forms of sources of energy are finite. They aren't renewable. Is it possible that one of the advantages of the current green movement in advocating increased funding for research and development of renewable resources would actually lead to the replacement of these finite sources, I mean, unless, as you mentioned before, fusion does kick in?
As the existing sources of energy become scarcer, so the premium that a private company will gain by finding or exploiting or developing a new source of energy will increase of itself. It doesn't need direction by the state. That's the great thing about the free market. It responds automatically. And there's no advantage whatsoever to be gained by the state trying to get involved and say, we must subsidize windmills, for instance, to some ludicrous extent. Because that is an utterly failed policy. You know, the windmills are just not the answer. They have a marginal impact at best, and they only really pay their way in countries where they're heavily subsidized. So there's no need for the state to intervene in any of this at all, because every time the state intervenes, as I've said, it costs twice as much and is half as efficient as if you leave it to the private sector. So my feeling would be no, the green movement is not any longer a useful movement. When Greenpeace was founded, it was founded by a friend of mine, among others. And within a year he left it because he said it had been taken over by people whose agenda was not that of protecting the environment. It was an avowedly political agenda. And here I will use the word left because that's the word that he used. And he said, therefore, that it had ceased to be valuable as an instrument of environmental reform. And he wanted nothing more to do with it. And I have come across one other of the original founders of Greenpeace who has said the same. So my feeling is that the green movement now has become too politicized in one political direction. And that, of course, reduces its effectiveness anyway. And the solutions that it advocates are broadly communistic. And you only have to look at the failed communist countries around the world to see what a disastrous environmental impact they had. And I think we want to steer away from that. The private sector is, in fact, much more responsive to the needs of the environment than any state sector can realistically ever be. And I think this is a case where we just should not intervene. We should stand back and allow the private sector to do its job with a minimum of sensible regulation, but not with state subvention. And that was the last question, sir. So may I once again thank you, sir, very much indeed for your kindness in having given me the ear of the House. I should also, in particular, like to thank all of you who have not only come here but endured several hours of me. I always find this flattering and congenial, but in your case you have asked between you a series of extremely interesting and revealing and helpful questions to which I've done my best to give straightforward answers. And God bless you all. Thank you for listening, and good night.